When I was a child, I possessed just a small ability to sense the supernatural. Now, there's a reason I say just a bit. This is because I saw ghosts daily, but only at a certain place and at a certain time. I never saw ghosts outside of that, so I was able to live my life like any other ordinary person without ever coming to harm. But still, as the years passed, I was unable to forget the ghosts I saw, and even now, they're still freshly carved into my heart. This strange experience felt more like a stab to the heart than something I feared, and even now, that same feeling is still there. Sometimes, I wonder if it was actually all just a dream or not. What on earth happened back then? Were the spirits trying to tell me something? I still don't know, even now. That's why I've never told anyone outside my family about it. But in order to sort out my own thoughts about the matter, I've decided it's time to tell someone else about this strange story. Right before I started elementary school, I lived in an apartment building. At a glance, it was a normal, everyday building, but once you got close to it, it seemed to be surrounded by a swirl of something black. I was only young at the time, however, so that black swirl never made me feel uneasy. The only thing I felt was strange at the time was the light on the road beneath the building during the evening. The light beneath our apartment, and our apartment alone, made a creepy noise and flashed constantly. If you looked up at the apartment from outside, then it looked like the lights in front of our apartment alone flashed creepily, and it was oddly darker than all the other apartments, steeping it in a strange atmosphere. Room 404. That was the room we lived in at the time. I wonder now why my parents chose that room. At the time, we called it by a terribly ominous name, the Death of Death. But that may have summoned even more spirits to this building, surrounded by a swirling vortex of something black. One night, I suddenly woke up during the early morning hours. I had to go to the toilet. I woke my sleeping father up next to me, and we left the bedroom together. We passed through the living room and kitchen, and then opened the door to the hallway. Something was there. Numerous pale blue silhouettes stood on either side of the hall. All of them stood with their backs to the wall and continued the entire length of the hall. Several figures I couldn't explain stood in our house. This confused me greatly, and I hesitated to continue forward. Yet my father proceeded without a hint of hesitation down the hall. It wasn't like the shadows didn't concern him, but rather that he didn't see them at all. The faintest slither of moonlight entered from the window behind me, only barely lighting the hall. My father left the lights off and used that light to proceed down the hall. I didn't want to be left behind alone, so I clung to my father's back and followed him down the hall full of pale blue shadows. Holding onto my father's sleeve tightly, I peeked at the shadows out the corner of my eye. I could only make out their outline, and they had no faces, meaning I couldn't read their expressions. But the figures only swayed on the spot, and they showed no signs of making any moves. But even so, they stood on both sides of the narrow hall, so as we passed through them, we accidentally touched them. My father's shoulder passed straight through the pale blue figure, like it was nothing but fog. Something was there, and yet we couldn't touch it. No matter how many times I rubbed my eyes, those pale blue figures really were all standing there. And as I looked at these figures without bodies, I suddenly realized Ah, these must be ghosts. I finally understood why my father's body passed cleanly through them. Some figures looked up at the roof while others were bent over and looking down at the ground. All of them had their eyes downcast, and I couldn't sense life in any of them. If I had to say one way or the other, they all looked to be rather sad, but that was simply how I felt by looking at them, so whether it was actually true or not was another matter. We passed through the figures and then finally reached the toilet. It was perhaps only a dozen or so steps to reach the toilet from the kitchen, but I say finally because it felt like it took forever to get there. My father looked down at me, unmoving, and then opened the toilet door for me. That made me come back to my senses, and nervously I looked inside. There were no ghosts in the toilet. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned the light on. A little of that light leaked out into the hall. Relieved, I turned to look at the pale ghosts in the hallway once again, and in the light, they seemed to disappear a little. And yet, even though their own silhouettes were disappearing a little, the spirits didn't budge an inch. After confirming that they weren't moving, I went into the toilet. I made my father wait for me in the hall. In an effort to shake how scared I felt, as well as kill any silence, I spoke to my father as I was in there. I feared that a pale spirit might come right through the wall and into the toilet, but no such thing happened. Even after I left the toilet, the figures were still standing there. I turned the light off, and darkness once again filled the hall, although now the pale outlines of the spirits stood out even clearer than before. I hurried my father back to the bedroom so I could get away from them as fast as possible, and before long, it was morning. I mentioned the pale figures that morning, but my mother just laughed and didn't believe me. Even my father, who was there with me, refused to take me seriously and said I must have been half asleep. The way they reacted annoyed me a little, and as I put bread in my mouth for breakfast, I snuck a peek down the hall. But I didn't see anything that even vaguely looked like a person there. After that, when I passed through the hall to go to the kindergarten, or on the way home, or to go to the toilet in the evening, I didn't see those figures again. And so I convinced myself that it must have been a dream, and let out a small sigh. But after noticing the existence of these spirits, I always woke up during the night at the exact same time. Every single night I woke up and needed to go to the toilet for some reason. And each time, I woke my father up to accompany me down the hall. Night after night, despite being half asleep, he took me down the hall to the toilet. And whenever we opened the door to the hall, the pale spirits were always there. And for some reason, my father never turned the lights on as we walked down the hall full of spirits. The spirits always stood on the spot, swaying back and forth, but otherwise unmoving. This continued night after night for almost 2 years. Whenever I brought it up with my parents, they refused to believe me, and as time passed, I stopped talking about it more and more. Plus, I gradually got used to seeing them, and because they never did anything, I became less afraid of them. It got to the point where it became a natural, everyday occurrence, like, this is just what our hallway is like. At the time, I was more afraid of going to the toilet by myself than I was of the existence of ghosts. Over those 2 years of seeing the pale figures every night, I realized several things. Depending on the day, the number of them, their shape, and their stature changed. Each night, when we opened the door, different people stood there. The smallest number was 3. The largest was dozens, crammed on both sides of the hall. Sometimes there was even an elderly spirit with a walking stick. But the one thing they had in common was that they were all adult men. I don't really know the reason why, but their physiques were all that of men, and they were about twice my size. This house is the death house of all death houses, so maybe our hallway is a pathway for spirits. The light in front of our house always flashes, so maybe it's a sign to the ghosts that this is the way to heaven. That was what I told myself as night after night we passed through the figures. It became a regular, daily occurrence to me, and the spirits never interfered with us either. Just once I took advantage of the situation and passed down the hall with both my arms spread out wide and touching the walls. Like when my father's shoulder touched them, they wavered like vapor, and I passed right through them. Time passed, and we moved right around the time I graduated from kindergarten. I had 2 siblings at the time, and my mother was pregnant with another. We moved out of the apartment that was now too small for 6 people and into a regular house. And even after our new house was decided, I still woke up at the same time every night to go to the toilet. As always, the lifeless pale figures stood on either side of the hall, and I even started to feel a little sad that I would soon have to part from them as well. Even though they were different each night, I had grown attached to those pale figures. Our last week in that apartment, I looked closer at each and every figure and, from the bottom of my heart, tried to convey my feelings to them. Two days before we moved, we opened the door only to be greeted by an unfamiliar sight. Normally the figures stood on either side of the hall, but on this night, they stood in front of the front door. Not only that, but it was the first time I'd ever seen a glowing red figure as well. Seeing a glowing red figure, in complete contrast to the pale ones, made a chill run down my spine, for the first time in a long time. The figure stood right in front of me. This was also a first. This figure, a girl, was also around the same height as me, or perhaps just a little smaller. Up until that point, the spirits had all been men, but for the first time, a young girl stood in front of me. It stood in front of the entrance as though it was telling me not to leave. This figure of the girl with pigtails felt entirely different to the other spirits. The usual lifeless pale adults stood as they always did on either side of the hall, but the red girl alone gave off a vibe that felt angry. She had no face, and yet our eyes met. I could sense a sharp will coming off her. I couldn't take a step forward even if I wanted to, and so I stood still facing that red figure. I couldn't approach this girl, who looked like she was ready to move at any moment, nor could I run away. But of course, my father, who couldn't see her, proceeded down the hall. All I could do was stand on the spot, unable to speak. The next thing I knew, I was lying in bed, and it was bright outside. I left the bedroom and went to the living room, but there was nothing different about this morning. I nervously looked down the hallway, but that girl was nowhere to be seen. What happened after that, and how did I get back into bed? I had no memories of it at all. would that girl appear again that night? I was so scared that I spoke to my parents again for the first time in a while about the ghosts. There was a red girl there last night. She was really angry, I tried to explain, but of course they wouldn't hear me out once they realized it was about ghosts. But I refused to give up, and over I tried to tell them about the night before. Maybe she came to say goodbye 'cause we're leaving soon. But after all of my attempts to explain the situation, that was the answer they came up with. But that girl was definitely angry. I didn't know about the others, but that girl was full of rage and was trying to tell me something. Yeah, maybe. But still, I forced myself to nod at what my parents said. I think part of me was probably uneasy if I didn't think that way too. And so, my parents practically dragged me to the front door. They wanted me to say thank you to the girl who came to say goodbye. I whispered to the empty door. "Thanks. Bye," was all I said. On our last night before moving, I slept the whole way through without waking up. And that's the story of my experience from childhood. There's no punchline nor an explanation for the unclear points, so it might be a little anticlimactic for some. But it's what really happened, and not a single thing here was made up. Even now, I live only a 20 or so minute drive away from that building, but I haven't been back to that creepy place since. Some time has passed since moving from there, but I haven't ever seen any ghosts since then. When I asked my parents about it, they said it was sold to someone else. Even now, someone still lives in room 404. I only ever saw that red girl once, but I wonder what she was trying to tell me. I've thought about it over and over, but I still don't know. Either way, this is something I actually experienced in the past, and it's all true. Are those ghosts still standing in that same apartment tonight as well? I'd love to find out, but I fear that if I saw them again, then something dangerous might happen, so I can't even approach that building anymore.